You ever walk away from an argument with him and think, how did I become the cool one? You didn't scream. You didn't insult him. You didn't threaten. You simply brought up something that hurt you, or asked for something basic, or said no. And yet somehow after the conversation, you're the one lying awake with guilt in your chest. Replaying your tone, replaying your words, wondering if you were unfair, wondering if you pushed too hard, wondering if you're becoming someone you don't recognize. And the most confusing part is that you can feel him watching you like you're dangerous, like you're the problem. So you start asking yourself a question that feels unbearable because it threatens your sense of who you are. What if I'm the villain? If you've lived inside narcissistic dynamics, that question is not irrational. It's the psychological outcome of a very specific pattern one that doesn't just hurt you, but rewrites your identity while you're still trying to love. And once you see how it happens, the shame begins to loosen. Not because the pain disappears overnight, but because it finally stops feeling like a mystery. A narcissist doesn't usually make you feel like the villain by directly calling you evil. They do it in subtler ways that reshape the emotional reality of the relationship. They do it by turning your normal responses into evidence against you. They do it by taking your humanity, your tears, your anger, your fatigue, your boundaries, and presenting it as proof that you're unstable, selfish, cruel, or impossible. So slowly, you stop trusting your own emotional signals. You start living inside his interpretation of you. And that is one of the most disorienting forms of control, because if he can convince you that you're the villain, you will spend your life trying to prove you're good. And a woman trying to prove she's good will tolerate almost anything. She will over-explain. She will apologize too quickly. She will soften her boundaries. She will accept blame that doesn't belong to her, not because she lacks strength, because she has a conscience. So let's unpack how this happens, gently, step by step, in a way that connects the dots. It usually starts with something small. You have a feeling. You're hurt. You feel dismissed. You feel lonely. You feel that something is off. You bring it to him carefully. You might even say it in the most respectful way you can. I didn't like how you spoke to me. I felt ignored. I need more reassurance. That made me uncomfortable. And instead of curiosity, you meet defensiveness. Not normal defensiveness, where someone says, I didn't realize, and then tries to understand. This defensiveness feels like a reversal. He becomes the injured one. He sighs like you're exhausting. He looks at you like you're exhausting. He says, so I'm the bad guy again. He says, so I'm the bad guy again. He says, you always do this. He says, you're never happy. And suddenly you're not discussing what happened. You're managing the emotional explosion he created around the fact that you had a feeling. This is the first move that makes you feel like the villain. Emotional role reversal. You bring hurt. He brings wounded outrage. And you end up comforting him. You might notice yourself doing it automatically. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I didn't mean it like that. I'm just trying to communicate. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought it up. And when you say that, you're not being weak. You're trying to restore connection. Because your nervous system understands something. When he turns cold or defensive, closeness becomes threatened. So you soften to keep peace. But each time you soften, your reality shrinks a little. And that shrinking has consequences, because then the next time you're hurt, you hesitate. You feel guilty before you even speak. You feel like your needs are too much. And a woman who feels guilty for having needs is already halfway to feeling like a villain. Now, the second move is gaslighting, but not always in the dramatic way people imagine. Sometimes it's simply the constant suggestion that your perception is unreliable. You're overreacting. That's not what I meant. You're too sensitive. You twist everything. When a narcissistic partner repeats these messages, your mind starts doing something very human. It tries to protect the relationship by doubting you. Because if you accept that he's wrong, you have to face something scary, that the person you love may not be safe. So your mind chooses the less frightening option. Maybe it's me. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I'm too emotional. That's not stupidity. That's attachment at work. Attachment makes you search for a way to keep the bond intact, and self-doubt is often the price. So now you're walking around with this quiet internal question: am I the one causing problems? And because you're a woman who wants to be fair, you begin reviewing yourself constantly. You monitor your tone, you monitor your words, you monitor your reactions, you monitor your facial expressions. You start trying to become untriggerable. And the more you try, the more tired you become, because you're now living like a person on trial. This is another way he makes you feel like the villain. He turns the relationship into a courtroom. In a healthy relationship, conflict is about understanding. In narcissistic dynamics, conflict becomes about winning. So facts don't matter as much as leverage. He won't address the issue you brought up. He'll find a flaw in your delivery. Why are you saying it like that? Why now? Why are you saying it like that? Why are you so emotional? Why can't you just let things go? So you start defending the fact that you have feelings. And when a woman is forced to defend her humanity, she starts feeling ashamed of it. Then comes blame shifting. This is where you bring up something he did, and somehow it becomes about what you did wrong. You say, "You lied to me." He says, "You made me feel like I had to." Or, "If you weren't so controlling, I wouldn't." You say, "Your words hurt me." He says, "Well, you pushed me." You say, "I feel lonely." He says, "You're impossible to please." Blame shifting does something very specific inside you. It makes you feel responsible for his behavior. And if you feel responsible, you start trying to correct yourself. You start trying to be better, calmer, less needy, less emotional, more supportive, and without realizing it, you become the one working on the relationship while he becomes the one judging it. That imbalance slowly creates a powerful internal identity shift. You start seeing yourself as the problem that needs fixing. And if you see yourself as the problem, then he automatically becomes the one who is right. That's how villains are created. Not with one insult, with repeated restructuring of responsibility. Now, another major way narcissists make you feel like the villain is through emotional withdrawal and silent treatment. Because silence is not neutral in a relationship. Silence is a message. When he withdraws after you express hurt, your body reads it as danger. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts race. You feel desperate to restore normal. So you reach out, you apologize, you explain, you offer peace, and he doesn't have to do much to make you do all of that. He just has to remove warmth. This is how the silent treatment turns you into the aggressor in your own mind, because now you associate expressing your feelings with punishment. You learn, if I speak, I lose connection. So you stop speaking. Or you speak in tiny, careful pieces. And when you finally do reach a breaking point, when you cry, when you raise your voice, when you say, "I can't do this anymore," he uses that moment as evidence. "See, you're crazy. See, you're abusive. See, you're the problem." And you might think, "But I didn't used to be like this." Exactly. That's the point. Narcissistic dynamics often provoke you into reactions that are out of character because prolonged emotional invalidation dysregulates the nervous system. When a person is repeatedly dismissed, denied, punished, or twisted, they eventually react, not because they're evil, because their system can't hold it anymore. And the narcissist is waiting for that moment, because then he gets something he can use. He gets a snapshot. He can ignore the months of silent treatment, the gaslighting, the provocation, the pressure, and point to your reaction as the whole story. This is another key pattern. He focuses on your reaction and erases the context. So you start feeling guilty for the one moment you broke down, even though you were surviving hundreds of moments that broke you. That's how you become the villain in your own story. Then there's the use of concern as control. He might say he's worried about you. He frames your emotional response as instability. "I think you need help. You're not okay. You're depressed. You have issues." Sometimes a woman hears that and thinks maybe he cares, but often it's not care. It's an attempt to make your pain look pathological, because if your pain is a disorder, then his behavior doesn't have to change. So you feel ashamed for having a nervous system response to emotional harm. You feel ashamed for crying, ashamed for being anxious, ashamed for not sleeping. And shame is the emotional glue of the villain identity. Because shame doesn't just say something happened. Shame says something is wrong with me. Now, here's where many women get stuck, the longing. Because even when you see the pattern, you still remember the moments when he was tender, the moments he cried, the moments he promised, the moments he apologized. So you keep thinking maybe that version is real. Maybe the villain story isn't true. Maybe he's right and I'm wrong. This is where false hope keeps you trapped between two versions of yourself. One version knows the pattern. The other version is attached to the idea that love can fix it. And because you're a woman with empathy, you often choose the version that allows the relationship to survive until you can't anymore. So let's name the deeper psychological function of making you the villain. It protects him from shame. If he can position you as the problem, he doesn't have to face himself. He doesn't have to face guilt. He doesn't have to face accountability. He doesn't have to face the idea that he harmed someone who loved him. So he externalizes the discomfort. He pushes it onto you. And you carry it because you can. Because you have a heart. And that's why you end up feeling like the villain. You have the emotional capacity to hold what he refuses to hold. You can reflect. You can feel remorse. You can self-examine. He can't, or he won't. So the blame migrates. It lands on you. Now here's an insight that often brings relief once it's fully felt. Feeling guilty doesn't always mean you did something wrong. In narcissistic dynamics, guilt is often a conditioned response to asserting your reality. You feel guilty when you set a boundary. You feel guilty when you say no. You feel guilty when you name harm. You feel guilty when you stop chasing, because the relationship trained you to equate your self-respect with cruelty. So the villain feeling is not a reliable moral compass here. It's a symptom of being repeatedly trained to prioritize his comfort over your truth. That doesn't mean you never reflect on your behavior. Healthy reflection matters. But reflection becomes distorted when it's happening inside a dynamic that punishes honesty. So what helps you regain mental clarity? You shift from evaluating yourself through his reactions to evaluating the relationship through patterns. Patterns are steadier than moods. Ask yourself quietly, when I express hurt, what happens? When I set a boundary, what happens? When I need comfort, what happens? When he is wrong, what happens? If the pattern is consistently reversal, blame, withdrawal, punishment, denial, then your villain feeling becomes explainable. Because you're put in a position where your needs are treated as offenses. And when needs are treated as offenses, the person with needs becomes the offender. Now, the practical direction here isn't about confronting him with a perfect speech. It's about reclaiming your internal authority. Internal authority is the ability to say, inside yourself, I know what I experienced. I know what my body feels. I know what the pattern is. This is especially important because narcissistic dynamics don't just attack your emotions. They attack your trust in your own mind. So every time you choose your perception over his story, you strengthen your clarity. Another stabilizing shift is to separate your reaction from your identity. Maybe you did raise your voice after months of being ignored. Maybe you did say something sharp after being provoked. That doesn't mean you are sharp. It means you were pushed beyond your capacity. In healthy relationships, partners notice when they're pushing you toward the edge. In narcissistic dynamics, pushing you toward the edge can be part of the control. So instead of using your worst moment as proof you're bad, you can view it as information. This dynamic is dysregulating me. That's not self-pity. That's a grounded observation. And once you see that, you stop trying to fix yourself inside a system that keeps breaking you. You start asking a different question. What would I feel like if my emotions were taken seriously? That question is powerful because it reorients you toward emotional reality rather than emotional defense. Another internal boundary that brings relief is to stop arguing with his version of you. A narcissistic partner will often assign you a role. Dramatic, selfish, cold, unstable, ungrateful. If you spend all your energy trying to prove you're not that, you stay trapped inside his narrative. So detachment begins when you stop trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you, not with bitterness, with a quiet withdrawal of energy. You stop pleading for fairness from someone who uses unfairness as leverage. You stop explaining your heart to someone who uses your heart as evidence against you. And you begin to build your identity in a place he can't access, your own internal truth. This is where emotional relief starts returning. Because the deepest exhaustion isn't just the fights, it's the constant identity defense, the constant need to prove you're good, the constant fear that you're becoming the villain. But you can begin to come back to yourself, not by forcing yourself to be strong, by becoming clear. Clear that your guilt has been conditioned, clear that your reactions were understandable, clear that the pattern was designed to keep you doubting, clear that a healthy partner doesn't need you to beg to be seen as human. And as you return to that clarity, you may feel grief. Grief for how hard you tried. Grief for how hard you tried. Grief for how much you carried. Grief for how often you apologized for having a heart. Let the grief be honest, because grief is what happens when you stop lying to yourself. And then something steadier can form. You begin to recognize your own character again. Not the character he accused you of, but the one you lived as. The woman who tried to communicate. The woman who tried to be fair. The woman who tried to be fair. The woman who tried to repair. The woman who held too much for too long. That woman is not a villain. That woman is someone who stayed in a dynamic that kept rewriting her. And if you're hearing this and feeling a quiet release in your body like, yes, that's what happened, hold on to that, because clarity is not just information. Clarity is protection. Protection from the urge to chase his approval. Protection from the need to explain your pain. Protection from the old reflex to shrink yourself so he feels bigger. And the end of the villain's story doesn't require his confession. It requires your recognition. Recognition that your guilt has been used as a tool. Recognition that your empathy has been exploited. Recognition that your humanity was never the crime. When you recognize that, you don't become cold. You become grounded. You become the kind of woman who can finally say, quietly inside herself, I'm not who he says I am. I'm who I've always been, a woman trying to love in a place that kept punishing love. And that realization doesn't just bring relief, it brings you back to you. Steadier, clearer, less alone. Like the story finally belongs to the right person again.